Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of 55 plus training sessions that will help you and your team avoid fraud, compliance fines, and bad vendor data. Or just sign up to get access to vendor process FAQs and to attend weekly drop-in live Q&A sessions. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. So this is another podcast episode answering a frequently asked question. This episode, I will talk about best practices for entering in the vendor information from the IRS Form W-9. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 257, FAQ. Where do I enter the data on the IRS Form W-9 in my accounting system? A quick reminder that the IRS has released a draft version of the Form W-9, and it has a revision date of October 2023. Now, the draft version they released was dated July 26, 2023, or rather that was the release date of the draft version. I just checked as of the recording of this podcast, and they do not have a later release date of an updated draft version. So I am going to refer you to podcast episode 252, which was, I think, the end of August. In any event, I compared the current version of the IRS Form W-9 to the draft version of the IRS Form W-9 to identify the changes. And there were really only two changes. So if you want to know what those are, go ahead and listen to that podcast episode. But today we are going to talk about a frequently asked question. And on last week's episode, I did the same thing. I talked about when a vendor has a new tax ID, do I have to create a new vendor record? So I get that question all the time. And so what I wanted to do for a few podcast episodes is just answer some frequently asked questions in case, you guys had the same questions. And so the second one is, where do I enter the data on the IRS Form W-9 in my accounting system? And let's go ahead and get started with that. I do have some caveats though, because everyone's accounting system is different. And as a practitioner, which if you've listened to my podcast for some time now, everyone knows, right, that I used to work for a big company, Verizon. And so we had 7 different accounting system ERPs. Of course, we had the big ones. There was SAP, 2 versions of it. There was PeopleSoft, 2 versions of that. And then we had some lift and shift accounting systems that we kind of inherited from acquisitions. But I will tell you, since I've been a consultant, trainer, speaker out here for the last 5 years, this September, there are lots more accounting systems and ERPs out there. And so you may have to adjust what I say, and I may even adjust what I say based on the different accounting systems that I have had access to or know of. But even with that, you may have to adjust yours even more based on how or what your configuration is. So what I'm basically saying is that I do not pretend to know all accounting systems, but I can give you the gist of what needs to go where and why, so that you can take that information and convert it into the correct fields in your accounting system or ERP. All right, so let's start with line 1, which is your vendor's legal name. This is the name that the vendor is registered with the IRS. It is also the name that, if the vendor is reportable, that you need to report on the 1099 and also with the IRS in combination with their tax ID. Now, in most systems, this is what would be entered into the vendor name field. Now, I do have a couple of caveats, but I want to talk about line 2 next. And line 2 is the business name / disregarded entity name if it is different from the vendor's legal name in line 1. And so this is the name to you and me in layman's terms. This is the vendor's DBA. So if the vendor has a legal name, but for example, their invoices will come in a different name, that different name is the name that will be on line 2. Now, if you have a DBA field in your system, this is where this name will go. And the purpose of adding the DBA name to your system in the first place is to allow for your invoices or the invoices from the vendor as they come in this different name. It allows that name to be found and those invoices to be posted to that vendor record. And now for some caveats, and I've actually seen quite a few of these. First off, let me just say though that more than often I've seen where the system does have a vendor legal name field. It also has a DBA name field, and the team will still enter in the vendor's DBA name, the name that the invoices are coming in the vendor legal name, because they think that's what needs to be done. If your system can accommodate it, you should not do that. You should put the vendor legal name in the correct field and the DBA name in the correct field. There are, however, some systems that are slightly different. So one caveat is there are systems that do not have a separate DBA field. And in that case, I've had that issue before, and the way we resolved it is we would add the vendor's legal name in the legal name field or the vendor name field, and then we would put DBA, and then we would put the name of the DBA, that the invoices are going to come in. So that's one caveat. The second one is some companies don't do it that way if they do not have a DBA field. They will actually put the DBA name as the first line of the address. And as many systems, can have multiple addresses, some of them may even have multiple DBAs. And so you'll see that the first line of the address is the DBA. Now, I'm not quite a fan of this. I have done this before because I've inherited vendor master files where the vendor records were this way. The issue is that not all of your vendors are going to have line 1 of their address as the DBA. And so if you ever, and you may have encountered this, if you have an AP automation project, now some of your vendors, when you export their data, some of them have line 1 as their actual address, street address, and other have line 1 as the DBA. And it may be even messed up a little further because some of them may even have line 1 as the attention to or something. So may have some cleanup there if you do it that way, but I have seen that done as well. And then the last caveat, or I guess different option that I've seen in accounting systems and ERPs is that they do use the DBA as the vendor name on the vendor record. However, they have a separate field that's called 1099 name. And this is where you would record the vendor's legal name on line 1, because that's the name that's going to be pulled on the 1099 for the vendor, and also in the 1099 reporting to the IRS for those reportable vendors. So if that's the way that your system works, then again, adjust accordingly. But in general, the line 1 name goes on the vendor's name in your accounting system or ERP, and line 2, the DBA, goes in the DBA name. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't as confusing as I'm remembering it being as I just said it. But let's go now to line 3. And line 3 is the line where there are check boxes for the applicable tax classification that the vendor needs to select. And so the tax classifications that they select, as you know, can determine whether or not that vendor is reportable or not. And so the tax classifications of, individual, sole proprietor, or single member LLC, C corporation, S corporation, partnership, trust, estate, and then there's one for LLC, and then there's a further designation for that LLC to identify how the vendor is going to be taxed, either a C for a C corporation, a S for S corporation, a P for a partnership. And then last, there is an other checkbox where they can actually enter in what they are. And mostly, this is used for nonprofits to indicate they're like a 501c3. It can also be for government. Sometimes you get a bunch of miscellaneous information in there because the vendors really don't know what to put in that field, or even if they should put anything at all. But the tax classification, there should be a field in your accounting system or ERP where you can identify what tax class they are. And again, the tax class can depend or can drive whether or not the vendor is reportable. So some systems will have separate fields, one to identify which tax class they selected, and you should fill that out based on whichever one they did select. And then they'll also have a separate field for the LLC, limited liability company, if they selected that. So you could enter in C, S, or P to determine, to identify how they are being taxed, because that can drive reportability as well. And then once you get done with that field, then there's a separate field to identify whether or not the vendor is reportable. Now, I have also seen accounting systems or ERPs that will even identify or let you identify for vendors that are reportable which form they're reportable on, like the 1099 MISC or the 1099 NEC, and then also which box on that form. Now, I will say, since the 1099 NEC is relatively new again, because it was a former form, but I still see in a lot of accounting systems or ERPs of my clients that still have old information. Like they don't have the 1099 NEC listed. They still have like box 7 on the 1099 MISC. Like that information has not been updated. However, on the back end, they will drive everything to the correct box, right? And so maybe your system is like that as well. And I'm just saying that to make sure that if you need to, do some research on your system, please do. Or if you already know that your system is not updated, don't feel bad, because there are lots of systems that have not been updated yet. At least on the user interface for that 1099 NEC change. All right, so that is the tax classification. Now, the next one, which is box 4, line 4, these are really the exemption codes to apply to show whether or not someone is exempt from withholding, also exemption from FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act code, to enter that in to see if to identify that they are exempt from that type of reporting. Now, typically those fields, we don't usually touch those because those don't really apply to the types of payments that we pay in accounts payable. So your system may have fields where you can input this information. But I will tell you, in my experience, yours may be different. I haven't had a lot of vendors that'll actually fill that out, fill those two fields out. So there was nothing for us to input. I will say, though, that for the exemption code, a great example is a corporation can put in exempt payee code 5 to note that they are exempt from reporting. So if that's the case, and maybe you even require that, it's not required, but if they do fill it out, identify if there is a field in your accounting system or ERP to input it. But I'll tell you from, my practitioner experience, we never did anything with box 4. All right, so now let's go to boxes 5 and 6. And this is really the address. So box 5 is the address, which is the street and the number. And then box 6 is the city, state, and zip code. Now, you might think this is a no-brainer, but I will tell you that if you have where vendors are submitting the W-9, and then maybe they also have a remit address, and then maybe they also have an ordering address, and they've got multiple addresses. We always try to put this address from the W-9 as the tax address or the mailing address in our accounting system or ERP, because some of them did allow us to identify what type of address it was, mailing address, tax address. And we did that because just in case the vendor was reportable, that is the address that we wanted the 1099 to go to. And so since we didn't want to have different rules for different types of vendors, reportable vendors and not reportable vendors, we had as a process to use the W-9 address as the mailing address or the tax address. And it would really depend on the system because some of the systems would label it differently. And so that's the big caveat, I think, with the address is that if you have a vendor that has multiple addresses, so maybe they have a W-9 address, maybe they have a different address on their invoices, maybe they are a purchase order vendor, and so maybe they have ordering addresses, you do want to make sure that you know which address comes from the W-9, because that is more than likely the address where the 1099 will be sent. Now, I'm going to skip to the tax IDs, and then I'll go back to line number 7, and then also the box for the requester's name and address. Now, skipping to the tax ID, so there is a separate tax ID field for the Social Security number, and then a separate one for the employer identification number. And they do this because the format is separate, and then it also allows you to know whether or not they're giving you an EIN or Social Security number, because the response codes from the IRS, or when you do the 10 match, you have to identify it, and then the response codes can depend on which one you entered in. And so in your accounting system or ERP, many of those systems will only have one field to put either tax ID, social security number, or employer identification number. And for that matter, maybe any tax ID or vendor registration number in other countries, right? Some of them have their own registration numbers that are separate from the IRS tax ID, and maybe they don't even have an IRS tax ID. So many systems only have the one field, and that is where it will go. There are some systems, though, like SAP and maybe even your system, that does separate different types of tax IDs or vendor registration numbers. So you may have a separate one for the employer identification number or EIN, a separate field for the Social Security number, SSN, maybe a separate field for value added tax or VAT, right, which is a tax that is added on invoices in the EU or VAT countries, I guess is a better way to say it. Also GST, right, goods and services tax. If you deal with non-US vendors in India, maybe even Canada, you may come across that. So understand your system and where your tax IDs need to go. Just know that we're talking about the W-9. And so wherever you put those tax IDs, that's what's going to pull onto the 1099 along with the vendor legal name. And that's what's going to be printed on the 1099 when you send it to the vendor, so it needs to be right. That's what's going to be filed with the IRS when you do your related 1099 filing, so it needs to be correct. And I say it that way because there are some systems that don't necessarily organize their vendor tax registration numbers or any kind of registration numbers in a great way so that you're uniform across all vendor records. SAP was like this too, right? So SAP, depending on your configuration, you may see it now where it has multiple tax ID number fields. So you just need to make sure that what needs to go into those fields have been documented so everyone is entering that data correctly. So the two that I skipped, one is line 7, which is list account numbers here. It's optional. And I got to tell you, I've never used this field and I can't find where the IRS even includes it in their instructions to the vendor to tell them what to put in that field. And there are actually, you probably already know this, instructions for the requester of Form W-9, and it doesn't even give us instruction on what we can put in there. So I would love to hear from any of you if you require your vendors to include a number in that field and what you use it for. All right, so that was line 7 that I skipped. And the other thing that I skipped, which again, I have never used, is the requester's name and address. It also is optional. But if you wanted to put your company's name and address as the requester, right, of the Form W-9, you could do that. And maybe, I don't know, that was used when back in the day when these were mailed out and they needed to be mailed back, and that was a way to put the address. I'm not sure. And I was back in the day, right? I do remember back when snail mail was the thing, and we never even did it then. So I would love to hear if you use or enter in your requester's name and address. And then also, again, if you use line 7 for anything that you want to capture or something that you might want to capture from the vendor. All right, so I hope that was helpful. There, again, are a lot of caveats with where you put the data in from the W-9 onto the vendor's record. But for those of you that have a fairly straightforward accounting system or ERP, shouldn't be too hard to identify where things need to go. Now, I forgot to mention that with the update of the Form W-9 from the IRS, right, the draft version for a revision dated October 2023 came out July 26th. And so it is expected to be published, released for use in October 2023, since that's the revision date. Due to that, I already had a training session for IRS W-9 examples by tax classification, right? What to look for when accepting from your vendor. And I do that training session on the third Wednesday of every month. I did that anyway, but in anticipation of this update for October, I have changed that into a weekly training session. So I added weekly training sessions because I figured it would be a lot of folks that want to know what the updates were and how they apply to the tax classification examples or examples by tax classification. And so I expanded the number of training sessions, and I will put a link to that training session. So if you are interested in going through the updated training session to get updated examples by tax classification on the new W-9 form, I will put a link in the show notes. It is a paid training session, but it is a great way to take a look at the updates and then also to get some examples by tax class. And they used to be, the training session was an hour. I did expand it to 90 minutes. So make sure if you want to take it to bring your questions, we will have time. All right, so I didn't think this one was going to end up being as long as it was, but I do thank you for staying on. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 257th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.